We are continuing our series, the book of Joshua. And if I could sum up this series in a couple of words, I would say it's all about the journey from the promise into the promised land. Right? We're talking all about the journey from the promise into the promised land. And what I want to do to start today is I just want to recap what we have been learning about. And so a few weeks ago, Ryan kicked off the series for us, and his call, or the call that he highlighted, was that God was calling the Israelites to be strong and courageous. He was calling the Israelites to be strong and courageous. And I'm not sure if you remember, but Ryan said, I wonder why God would tell someone 3 times to be strong and courageous. And Ryan suggested that perhaps it was because they were feeling weak and afraid. Right? Perhaps the Israelites were feeling weak and afraid, and so they needed their God to remind them, to call them to be strong and courageous. And in the second week, we heard from Judy, and Judy reminded us all about being aware of the presence of God. And that the presence of God is with us. And she talked about how the presence of God who was with Moses, that he is actually with us. And the most exciting part, I thought, about Judy's message was that the New Testament told us that God would do even greater things through us than what he did with Moses. That God would do even greater things. And there was a call to remember that the presence of God was with us. And then the third week we heard from Matt. He did a wonderful message, and he talked about the call to be obedient. And one of my favorite parts of his message, he talked about his favorite Bible verse. He said his favorite Bible verse was, "Draw near to God and he will draw near to you." And Matt talked about how it's actually a really safe and comfortable way to meet with the presence of God. Right? It's a really safe and comfortable way to meet with the presence of God. And in some seasons of our life, this is how we meet with God. We meet with God in a really safe and comfortable way. But in the story of Joshua, there is a different call. There is a call to be obedient, to actually follow the presence of God as he is leading us into somewhere new and somewhere unknown. And that doesn't feel so safe and comfortable, does it? I wonder why we needed to be reminded to be strong and courageous. And then we heard from Judy last week, and she spoke about the call to purify ourselves. The call to purify ourselves. To essentially empty out all of the bad yuck and gunk and stuff that we fill ourselves with, to actually empty that out so that God can fill us up and do something new in us. And so this is the journey that we have been on as a church, as we have looked at the journey from the promise into the promised land. And I just want to zoom out a little bit further, and I want to look at the journey that the Israelites were on. Right, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, the Israelites were on a journey from the promise into the promised land. And so the Israelites, before the book of Joshua, 600 years before that, a man named Abraham, was given a promise. Right? And this promise was that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Right? This man who was quite many years on, and his wife was very old, and they still had 0 children. He was given a promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that I have a special land set apart for you that will be yours. But you see, it didn't go straight from the promise into the promised land. This wasn't a quick and easy journey, but the Israelites actually took some detours. And so one of the first detours that I want to highlight today is that the Israelites actually went into a season of slavery. They went into a season of slavery where they were enslaved by the Egyptians. And then the Israelites were set free from slavery. And so a man named Moses, he's very famous, so you probably know about him. But God called Moses to lead the Israelites out of slavery. And so miraculously, God worked with Moses and the Israelites were led out of slavery. But once again, it wasn't straight into the promised land. There was actually a season of wilderness that the Israelites stepped into. And so this is the journey that the Israelites had been on from the promise into the promised land. And before we open our Bibles today, I just want to take some time to share with you a testimony. And so I'm going to invite Mark up on the stage. And we just want to share with you, I guess, the story that our family has been on in the journey from the promise to the promised land. And so I guess to begin, I just want to talk to you about a promise that I felt like God had given me. And so when I was pregnant with Lily, I don't know if you guys noticed, we have a few children, but Lily is 2 now. But when I was pregnant with Lily, Mark and I were just going through quite a difficult time. And Mark will go into details a little bit later. But in this time, I went to God. I went to God and I was just pouring out my heart. And usually when I have a quiet time, I read my Bible. And that day in particular, I was reading through the book of Exodus. And I don't know about you guys, but usually the book of Exodus isn't very helpful. Like, do you guys ever find that? Like, it's not like, sometimes during the Bible you think, oh, great, answer, revelation, powerful. But Exodus sometimes it's like, I'm just trudging my way through. Anyway, so I was reading through the book of Exodus, and in church, I think it was Ryan, he talked about if the Bible ever mentions a tree, you should pay attention, because trees usually have a spiritual significance. So anyways, here I was in a really hard time, difficult time, a bit desperate from an answer, but I'm thinking, Exodus, you're not really going to be helping me. But then I read about the almond tree, and I thought, oh, tree, pay attention. And so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to look up what the almond tree is try to get, I'm trying to find something here, right? I'm trying to find something. And so I look up the almond tree, and it said that the almond tree is the first tree to fruit in the season, to flower in the season. So the first tree to flower in the season, but it's the last tree to fruit. It's the last tree to fruit. And I felt like God say to me, Rachel, you and Mark, for those of you that know us, we've been together for a long time. We started dating when we were 14 and 15, and so very much our relationship was one of the first to flower. And I felt like him saying, your relationship was one of the first to flower, but trust me, there is fruit to come. There is fruit to come, but it might just take a while. And so I don't know about you, when you hear a promise from God, you're sort of like, is it, isn't it, is it, isn't it? And so I just held on to that. And I sort of put it in my pocket almost. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to hold on to that. And I have. And then if I fast forward a little bit on, and by this stage we had Lily, she was probably about 4 months old. And I was sitting in church, I was sitting just over there in these seats. And we were hearing a sermon, and it was, as a church, we were being called to fast. Right, we're being called to fast. But me and food have had some weird relationships, and I'd just been pregnant and I was breastfeeding, and so I thought, I don't think food's a good idea. But I felt like God say, I want you to fast from entertainment. So from reading, I love to read, not educational books, I just want to be entertained, and TV. And so in that church service, I thought, you know what, I'm going to fast. And so whenever I would normally read my book or watch a TV show, I'm going to pray and journal and read my Bible. And also in that service, little Scardy, who's I think here today, I think she's downstairs, but she was just like looking at Mark and just sort of like staring into him and making all these nice faces. And I felt like God whispered to me, he is a good man. He is a good man. And as I look back on that day, I didn't know what was coming a couple of days later. 2 days later, it was only going to get more difficult. But you see, I think God knew that in this next season, I didn't need to be entertained, but I needed to be sustained. And he knew that I needed to be reminded that the man that I chose to stand next to, that he is a good man. And so now I'm just going to hand it over to Mark, and he's going to share a little bit about what this season for him has been like.
Yep. So before I sort of get into things, a little bit of a background as to what got me to being here. So basically, it was probably 3-4 weeks ago. Went for a walk with Rachel, and she said, "Hey, Mark, can I ask you a question?" And any husband knows that that's entering into dangerous territory, and I didn't know where it was going to go. So my response was no, and I kept walking. But I thought that's a little bit harsh. All right, I'll hear her out. And then so Rachel said, I was wondering if next time I get up to preach, if you would be able to jump up and join me. And then I cut her off there and I said, nope, no chance, not going to happen. And I thought, okay, no, be nice, hear her out. And she said, just wanted to know if you would like to share a little bit about your story and your testimony with me. And so my plan was a good one of procrastination. I just said, let me think about it, hoping that things would pass and then hopefully I wouldn't be here today and have to talk about it, but we'll just, placate her for the time being. Fast forward a couple of days later, and Rach spoke about it in her intro that Matt had a sermon where he was talking about obedience and about stepping out and stepping into that water and being obedient, even if it is tough and if it doesn't feel safe and comfortable. And so, unfortunately, that got me to this point now where I am in front of you, and I will be sharing a little bit about what Rach was sort of alluding to there, and a bit of our, our tough time, and a little bit of my testimony. So for me, bit of a sort of background still and a bit of an intro. I've always had this sort of love and hate relationship with alcohol. So there's been lots of times where I have been drinking, lots of times where I haven't been drinking. It's just kind of been on and off for a long part of my adulthood. And so for me, this is pretty much sort of my story of this idea of slavery and sort of where I was at this time. And I guess a little bit of part of me sort of going into, into that wilderness period as well. And so basically where I was probably 3 years ago was kind of sitting in that place where I'd say I was a slave to alcohol. I was a bit of I was a closet alcoholic. Everything was kind of hidden. It was all in the background, hidden from Rach, hidden from everybody else. And if lots of you know me, you'll feel like you know me pretty well. I've been here for 20 odd years or so. But often the Mark that's kind of on the outside can be quite different to the Mark that I kind of keep hidden away and guarded inside. And this was all a part of that. And so this was all sort of happening on the inside, in the background, not evident to anybody else. I did a pretty good job of sort of hiding things and keeping that part of me hidden, and just keeping it as a big secret, in my life. And then basically, as I said, sort of this has been going on, but the last probably 3 years ago, got to the point where pretty much all of my decision making was based around alcohol. So whether that be, when can I drink, how can I get alcohol, how can I hide alcohol, how can I find some alone time so I can drink alcohol, pretty much all of my decision making would be based around, that idea of me being a slave to alcohol or wanting to drink alcohol. And so that obviously led to a really tough period for me personally, but obviously a tough period for our family. And if you're here for Lily's dedication a couple of weeks ago, Rachel alluded to that. Where we just, after her birth, we just went through this really tough time. And that was all, even though she didn't say it there, that was all based around this concept of me and my issue with alcohol all coming to light and no longer being a secret anymore. And so... basically, for me, that was a time where not long after Lily's birth, everything was out in the open, which is, in one sense, is freeing for me and not having to keep things a secret anymore. But also, that was obviously a really tough time for us as we sort of battled through this. And for me, personally, not knowing, obviously I'd kept this a secret from Rachel, and I'd lied about it for years and years. And so for me not knowing, is Rachel going to stay with me through all of this? Me not knowing, can I actually stop drinking alcohol? Can I actually get over this? And just to that point of where, for me, just knowing, okay, well, how am I going to handle this? Do I just keep drinking? Do I just give up? Do I just take the easy way out? And so, yeah, not really knowing what the future was to hold. And I guess in keeping with this theme, sort of not knowing, is there a promised land at all? Or am I just going to be stuck in this concept of slavery, or this place of slavery? So for me, I guess this battle from slavery into the wilderness, like I said, I didn't know what the promised land was going to be. I didn't know what it looks like. To be honest, I probably still don't know what that looks like. But it would be nice if I said that it was a really quick and easy transition from slavery into the promised land, but it hasn't been. It's been a long battle. It's been a long time moving through this. It's been it's been slow. It's been hard. But I feel like there's some success now, and I'm, even though I don't know if I'm in that promised land yet, I definitely feel like I've moved out of that slavery side of things, and moving towards, whether that be the wilderness or whether that be into the promised land. And so, to the point, sort of fast forward now, that, as I said, that was about 3 years ago that all sort of came, 2 years ago sort of came to light, but 3 years ago that I was sort of dealing with it all as well. And it's basically got me to where I am now today. So the point where I can say I've been sober for 18 months now, and so haven't slipped or anything. So I haven't gone back there, haven't slipped, and I would still talk about, be a little bit like the Israelites, and saying that there's that idea of when they look back and they think that slavery, maybe I'd be better off in slavery. There's still times where it's like that, but sort of happy to say that yes, whilst I don't know what that promised land looks like, I still feel like I'm at least moving in that direction. So that's a bit about me.
Thank you so much, hun. Really appreciate you sharing. And I wonder if you can hear the journey that we are on, that us as a family that we have been on, that the Israelites have been on, that us as a church have been on. And today I want to say that we are all meeting here on the edge of the wilderness. At the edge of the wilderness. At this point, we're going to pick up the story, and we are going to have I want us to hear from God. Here we are standing on the edge of the wilderness today. And I wonder, as we read this story, what does God have for us next? What does God have for us next? And so we're going to open up our Bibles, and we're going to read from Joshua chapter 3. I'm just waiting for the slide to come up. That's good. 13 to 17. And so what we're going to do is we're going to read through this one verse at a time, and then I'm going to explain a couple of things. But before I begin, I just want to let you know that before chapter 13, right, God has spoken to Joshua. God has spoken to Joshua and given him an instruction. And then what we're going to see in this first verse then is that Joshua is going to take this instruction from God, and then he is going to tell the Israelites what's next. And so verse 13 says, the priests will carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth. As soon as their feet touch the water, the flow of the water will be cut upstream, and the river will stand up like a wall. And so here Joshua is saying, this is what we are going to do. Right? He says the priests, and I don't know if you know too much about the priests in the Old Testament, but the priests in the Old Testament were a select, a specific, and a special chosen people. If you wanted to be a priest, you had to be born into a specific tribe. There's 12 tribes of Israel, and one of those tribes were the Levites. And so if you were to be a priest, you had to be born into this tribe. But just because you were in this tribe didn't mean that you were a priest. You still had to be selected. You still had to be special to become a priest. And if you were one of the special, specific, select few, then you had the privilege of being near and working with the presence of God. Right? You had the privilege of being near the presence of God. And so this is why the priests were asked to pick up the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was essentially a symbol of God's presence. And so inside this big wooden chest was the presence of God. And so here Joshua is saying, I'm going to choose these special, select, specific people, and they are going to walk with the presence of God into the river. And so once the Israelites were given this instruction, we can read on to see what they do. It says, so the people left their camp. Right, they heard the instruction. God gave an instruction to Joshua. Joshua gave the instruction to his people, and the people moved. So the people left their camp to cross the Jordan, and the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. It was the harvest season, and the Jordan was overflowing its banks. And so I've just got a picture here of what the Jordan looks like during the harvest season. And I think the point that the author's trying to make is that this is no ordinary river crossing. This is no ordinary river crossing, right? That this river was flowing faster and fuller than what it usually does. Because of the spring rain, because of the snow that had melted off the mountain, this extra lot of water was rushing and gushing and through the river. And so this is an actual picture of the Jordan River and what it might look like during the harvest season. And then we can keep on reading the story. It says, but as soon as the feet of the priests who were carrying the ark touched at the river's edge, above that point began backing up until the riverbed was dry. And so what I want to highlight in this verse is that it wasn't actually until the feet of the priests hit the river that the river stopped running. Right? It wasn't until the feet of the priest hit the river till the river stopped running. It says, then all the people crossed over near the town of Jericho. Meanwhile, the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Lord's covenant stood on dry ground in the middle of the riverbed as the people passed by. They waited there until the whole nation of Israel crossed the Jordan. And so I just want to pause for a moment and just take note that the priests, the special, select, specific people, and the Lord of the earth, they stood in the middle of the river. They stood in the most compromising, the most dangerous, the most vulnerable position. They stood there and they waited until the whole nation crossed the river and entered into the promised land. And so as we think about this story and as we reflect on this story, what I would like to do today is I would like to compare the crossing of the Red Sea to the crossing of the Jordan River. Okay, so the crossing of the Red Sea is the story of Moses, and I'm hoping that most people are familiar with this story. But the interesting thing is that these two crossing of the waters bookend the wilderness series. Right? These two crossing of the waters bookend the wilderness series. And I think as we compare these crossing of the waters, I think it's interesting to note what has changed in the relationship with God and his people. Right? What has changed in the relationship with God and his people? And you see, the first thing that I want to highlight is that when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, that they were running away from their enemy. Right? They were running away from their enemy. They had just come out of slavery, but the Egyptian soldiers were chasing after them to bring them back. And so the Israelites had the choice to sort of wait for the soldiers to catch up to them or to go into the parted water. And so the Israelites ran away from their enemy. But the difference with the Jordan River is that the Israelites were running towards their enemy. Right? They weren't running away, they were running towards their enemy. Rather than running away from the thing that was scaring them, they were running towards the things that were scaring them. And it makes me think, what is more strong and courageous? What is more strong and courageous? Is it more strong and courageous to run away from the things that make you scared? Or is it more strong and courageous to run towards the things that scare you? You see, God had been on a journey with his people. right? He had given them a promise. He had set them free from slavery. He had walked with them in the wilderness. And now he is saying to them, you don't have to run away anymore. You don't have to run away anymore. You can run towards the things that scare you. And then the other thing as we look at these crossing of the waters that I want to highlight is that in the crossing of the Red Sea, right, if you don't know it, I'll do a quick reenactment, okay? So I'm Moses, there's the Israelites, the Egyptians are chasing after them. Moses pulls out his staff, the waters part, and then the people walk through the river or the water, right? But in the crossing of the Jordan River, the water hasn't parted yet. The water hasn't parted yet. God is asking his people to step into a raging river. Right? God is asking his people to step into a raging river. He said, you know what? Because I have given you a promise, because you have seen me set you free from slavery, because you know that I have walked with you in the wilderness, I am now calling you to step out into the raging river. What takes more strength and courage? To walk into a river that has already been parted, or to walk into one that is full and is flowing and overflowing its banks? And the other thing that I want to highlight in the difference of the Red Sea to the crossing of the Jordan River is that in the crossing of the Red Sea, right, we see Moses do about 10% of the work, and God do about 90% of the work. If I was to describe the interaction between God and the Israelites in this crossing of the sea, I would say that we're seeing God working for his people, right? We see God working for his people. But when they cross the Jordan River, I see something different, right? I see a God who is working with his people, right? I see a God who is working with his people. And once again, I think, what takes more strength and courage? To have a God who does the work for you, or to trust in a God who works with you? To trust in a God who works with you. You see, God is calling his people into a different kind of relationship, right? Because he says, I have given you a promise. I have set you free from slavery. I have walked with you in the wilderness, and now I want you to step into the promised land with me. Right? He doesn't want to simply work for us, but he wants to work with us. And in this story, we see that God brings the miracle. Right? It is God's presence that is making the waters part. God brings the miracle, but the priests brought faith. Right? The priest brought faith. And do you know what that I think is the most incredible thing? Right? When we see God, the Master, the Lord of all the earth, when we see God working with his people who can step out in faith, it wasn't just about one person getting into the promised land. Right? It wasn't just the priests getting into the promised land. It was the whole nation of Israel walking into the promised land of God. It was the whole nation of Israel walking into the promised land of God, because the priests stepped out in faith. Because the priest worked with God, a miracle could happen. The water was parted, and so a whole nation could step into the promised land of God. And so today, as we sit here, I wonder if you're thinking, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for me? And I talked earlier about the role of the priest in the Old Testament. But we say at church that, we don't live in the Old Testament anymore. This was a time before Jesus. But in the Bible, we read in the New Testament, and we are living in the New Testament now. And do you know in the New Testament who are the priests? Do you know in the New Testament who the call is to step into the water, to stand in the middle of the river with the presence of God, making a way for people to enter the promised land? Do you know who the priests are today? It is us. It is not the paid pastors. Please do not misunderstand me. The priests are not the paid pastors. We, the people of God, if you are a follower of Jesus, if you are a believer in Jesus, then you are a priest. You are a priest. And what God is saying to you today, right? God is saying to you today, I have given you a promise, right? I have given you a promise, right? And he is saying that I have set you free from slavery. I have set you free from the things that you have been enslaved to. He has said that I have walked with you in the wilderness. I have never left you, even though you wandered, even though you didn't follow my path directly. I have walked alongside you through your wilderness. But he is saying today that you are my priest. You are my priest. And I am calling you to step out in faith. And so that is the call today. The call today is to step out in faith. Right, and the definition of faith is a strong belief based on spiritual conviction and not proof. Right, a strong belief based on spiritual conviction and not proof. And so, church, if there is one thing that you could remember from today, it is this. Between the promise and the proof, there was an act of faith. Right, between the promise and the proof, there was an act of faith. Church, do you hear that your God is calling you today to step out with an act of faith? To step out with an act of faith. And for us as a family, like for Mark today, he stepped out in faith. He said, I am scared. I am vulnerable, but I'm going to step out in faith. Elsa B, who's up on the tech desk, this is her very first time on sound. She didn't know what she was doing, but she heard the call to step out in faith. And she has changed every slide at the most perfect time. Yeah. I was talking to a friend this week who comes to our church. Actually, I'm going to say her name. Her name's Leanne, sorry. And Leanne has felt like God is calling her into a new season at her work. And so she wants to go for a scholarship, and she believes that that is where God is calling her to. But the waters haven't parted. She's actually stepped out, and she's starting to pay for that degree herself. She is taking a day of leave without pay each week so that she can step out in faith and trust that God will part the waters as she steps out. Church, this is the call. God is calling us to step out in faith. Right, he has given us a promise, and by golly gosh, he wants to show us the proof. But he is calling you today to step out with an act of faith. And so I wonder, what is that act of faith for you? What is that act of faith for you? Do you know it could be something as little as changing the seat that you sit in at church? Right? If you see someone who's sitting there by themselves and, you think, I want to go sit next to that person. Or maybe it's moving more so towards the front. Maybe that's your act of faith. Because you know what? If this church is a promised land, right? If this church is a promised land, every single one of these chairs is filled. And people want to sit in the front, right? And there is no one sitting there by themselves, because if we are the promised land, what would that look like? What would that look like? How can we make that happen? How can we allow the presence of God to work in our lives so that as a church, we are the promised land?